back of the rim. Garnett on the slam. Using Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry.
Welcome to another holiday season, as the 2020s are currently moving faster than Tyrese Maxey, who is not a part of this video. Yeah, today we're actually taking a look at every team's best lineup by total net points of the century. This is really less of a rankings video because some lineups played way more possessions than others, so that kind of accounts for the rankings a little bit. But I thought it was a good chance to talk about some lineups we may not have ever really spoken of and how they really meshed together, what they did well, and what ended up happening to them. And once again, thanks to the members who are making these videos possible. At the very bottom of the list, Chicago shows up way down at plus 108 net points, and yet for a minute it felt like they were next up in the East. This was the start of the very brief Rose window after they signed Carlos Boozer and leaned all the way into defense, rebounding, and Derek's burst. For the first time, it was more than enough to compete at a high level, although it unfortunately coexisted with the beginning of the super team's arm race. The goal around the time was to bring at least 3 stars together, which would in theory overpower most rosters. Chicago technically had 2 in Rose and Boozer, which in this lineup were flanked by another solid wing option in Deng, a high energy center in Noah, and a defense first 2 in Brewer. All perfect support to allow Rose to do what he did, just not talented or healthy enough to overcome Miami. This lineup only started together in 2012, and barely got that much time together anyway since Rose's injury started up during the regular season. We never even got to see how it would have fared against the Heat in a rematch. The theory was that they now had enough scoring and defensive options to prevent a rerun of the previous conference finals. While the size and defensive grid of the lineup might have given them a run, again, you needed star power during this era, and healthy or not, they really didn't have enough. At plus 136, the Knicks' entry is that double point guard group from 2013 featuring Raymond Felton and Jason Kidd, along with J.R. Smith, Melo, and Tyson Chandler rounding it all out. It was the peak of the Mike Woodson era, finishing with 54 wins that still stands as their most since the 57 they won before losing the finals in '94. This lineup took advantage of budding concepts, allowing them to be small and modern for the time. While Amar'e Stoudemire was still on the roster, the wheels were in the process of coming completely off at the hands of injuries. Not to mention, he was one less player Melo would have to share the ball with. Remember, this was also around the time Miami often ran Bosh as the only big, and the frenetic pace on top of the star power was falling out of reach of the rest of the league. Assuming a playoff rematch with the Heatles was looming, New York's 2 ball handlers kept the ball moving, Melo played the 3 and 4 as the primary scorer, and Tyson was the rim runner and anchor. They bombed threes, leading the league in 3-pointers made per game at just 11. Compare this to them again leading the league today at 17 per. They protected the ball and let JR torch second units as he won 6th Man of the Year. It was extremely hard to match in the regular season, and very much gave the impression it'd be them in Miami in the conference finals. Unfortunately, the playoffs got big and grimy. Indiana's size with Hibbert and West squeezed the paint and the glass. Kidd went ice cold as a 40-year-old might at that time of year. And Melo's near 30 points a game just wasn't enough to make up the difference. That core still owns one of the Knicks' most efficient 5-man groups of the century. But the ceiling showed up in May, as it often did for units who couldn't quite perfect their small ball attempts. Surprisingly, there were very few teams who did. You might have noticed how comparatively, these 2 units played few possessions together, as within their own franchises this century, there wasn't a ton of competition. Here's one many of you will have almost no context for. For Charlotte, we go all the way back to the early 2000s Paul Silas group. Baron Davis flanked by 2 shooters in David Wesley and Jamal Mashburn, supported by stalwart bigs in PJ Brown and Eldon Campbell. Hornets basketball of that time was about slowing the game down, relying on defense, and then letting Baron and Mash burn clock in the half court. Davis was one of the most electric guards of his time and has been totally overlooked in history. His burst and live dribble combined with insane athleticism made him a nightmare as a point guard, something which was only just then becoming popular at the position. Unfortunately, as with many teams of this kind in history, other units were simply a tougher playoff matchup. Take for instance 2002, when they gentlemen swept T-Max Magic, another roster with limited creation. It looked promising until round 2 brought the eventual East champs in New Jersey, where they were then gentlemen swept by a more well-rounded squad. That was the trade-off with this 5. They could drag you into a bar fight, but with limited 3-point volume and only 2 real creators, late game and series shot creation favored real contenders. Still, for 2 straight springs, this 5 was a problem, and it's the last real peak before the franchise moved and Charlotte hit reset. The fact they remained the team's best lineup in the last 25 speaks volumes. To what should be a surprise, Toronto's entry on the board isn't the Kawhi title group. Rather, we're looking at what came before it around the mid to late 2010s. Kyle Lowry and DeMar would be the obvious backcourt, with OG Anunoby at 3, who didn't even get to play in the title run, mind you, with a massive front line featuring Serge Ibaka and Jonas Valanciunas. The 59 games they won in 2018, earning them first seed, was actually a game better than 2019 when they won it all. Despite DeRozan being a mid-range demon, the offense had been modernized just enough as they were 4th in threes for the year. JV was often used as a handoff hub and not just a big body, while OG's rookie minutes gave them a switchable wing who didn't require touches. Ibaka took the highest volume of threes in his career, hitting on 36%, which gave them an athletic stretch 4 shot blocker, meaning every possession they were both physical and offensively competent, and this was terrifying for most regular season teams. But in May, when things slowed down, you'd often see Lowry, DeRozan, or both slow down with it. The half-court offense in this playstyle was much less successful and unable to answer the massive runs LeBron and the Cavs could go on, raining threes coupled with demoralizing plays. It's still a great snapshot of what they were right before the leap, but management figured they were just one superstar short, and they were correct. Only one spot removed from a team they conquered, early 2000s Jersey was better than most will ever remember since they had to play the Spurs and Lakers back-to-back after emerging from a sketchy conference. Looking at the lineup though, they made perfect sense. Jason Kidd running with Kerry Kittles, another athlete in Richard Jefferson who was perfect for Kidd's vision, then the staple bigs necessary in the 2000s featuring Kenyon Martin and Jason Collins. Led by Byron Scott, they appeared in consecutive finals and were actually extremely close to thwarting the 04 Pistons, which may have resulted in 3 straight. I made a video on this one way back. Defense and rebounds consistently turned into a runway for Kidd, which at minimum resulted in early offense. With the spacing of Kittles and Collins setting punishing screens while also anchoring the backline, the regular seasons were successful. Of course, like many teams on this list, their limitations were highlighted by the era. Martin and Collins were cool. They weren't Duncan and Shaq cool. Not to mention these were fully built out teams with multiple stars and or superstars. Still, over 25 years, this athletic unit tailored to Kidd's tempo remains their best lineup with plus 189 net points. I have a feeling another Nets group would have caught them if they played the games necessary to do it. Also at plus 189 with a plus 16 net rating across roughly 1,200 possessions, Atlanta brings the late 2000s, early 2010s 5 who were electrifying yet never contending. Bibby and Jamal Crawford filled the backcourt, which was just a nightmare offensively for opposing defenders. If you're a Magic fan, you still feel the burn of Crawford to this day. Then of course, the most notable Hawks of the time in Joe Johnson, Josh Smith, and Al Horford. This was ISO era Atlanta. Joe and Jamal taking turns cooking in space, Bibby spacing and organizing, along with Josh's athleticism being most responsible for the highlight factory era. Young Horford tied it all together with short roll playmaking and rim protection. The lineup did what it was supposed to, producing their first 50-win season in 2010 since 1998. Then, like most of the franchise's units, it topped out in spring when the isolation diet predictably failed to translate. Against the best defenses like Dwight's Magic, who they were swept by, possessions got sticky and the small ball look gave up size at the rim before it was truly popular. They could squeeze past the first round opponent on toughness and late clock buckets, but most of these cores around the time were obvious marks for contenders. So since 2000, that's Atlanta's most punishing 5. Which I guess isn't as surprising as it sounds. The 15 Hawks really did not get a ton of time together. That's why they're simply known as the 15 Hawks. Oh, this one is gonna hurt Bucks fans, and it's also a bit of a no-brainer. Milwaukee's goes to the very recent 5, who, upon joining, probably convinced people they'd still be winning today. Damian Lillard joined Giannis in a totally unexpected blockbuster trade, making their lineups with Beasley, Middleton, and Lopez absolutely deadly. On paper, it was everything you draw up. A Dame and Giannis two-man game with a progressively more injury-prone Chris as the release valve, Beasley stretching corners to give the stars clean runways, and Brook anchoring drop-in spacing the floor. When those 5 were actually out there, it seemed they would be as unfair as they looked on paper. Empty side pick and rolls, drive-in kicks, key phrase, when they shared the floor. It was their most used lineup of 2024, though Middleton only appeared in 55 games. Then the playoffs started, and he was the only healthy piece of the trio. Bucks fans have done little but suffer since the title. In 2025, Beasley moved on, while management gave up on Chris, making this lineup a fairly underrated what-if. Unlike some of the others listed, they had a great chance to emerge from their conference and even possibly win it all. To no surprise whatsoever, Miami brings in the LeBron-era small ball five, featuring the Heatles with Chalmers and Battier flanking. My goodness, what a miserable team to run into on 2K at the time. I'm not sure if they're credited as such, but it's the group that initially turned pace and space into a problem. Bosh at the 5, especially as he developed a 3, yanked rim protectors out of the paint, Battier parked in corners with that quick trigger above the break 3, and LeBron used post-ups and middle PNR to force 2 defenders every trip. Chalmers gave them a steady handle and spot-up threat. Wade continued his on-ball production with weak side cutting, and the defensive options were just unfair against most units. Their fingerprints were everywhere. The 27-game win streak, the switchability and suffocating on-ball options, highlights that ring to this day, and of course, winning. Funny enough though, in 2013, it was only their 8th most used 5-man combination. It wasn't without its weaknesses. With so much talent on the roster, about the only place opponents could aim was defensive rebounding and size when the series slowed. This as a whole was why certain teams got so close to, or did beat them over the years. How about another Braun group? Irving, Smith, James Love, and Thompson is 2015 through 2017 Cavs basketball personified. The spacing was as good as it could get with a player on the floor with no range, as JR, a few years removed from his 6th Man of the Year award, parked as the spacer and spark plug once he was traded for mid-season in 2015. Love stretched opposing fours out to the arc and ghost screened. LeBron was just LeBron, and it finished out with Kyrie as the ultimate late clock dagger. But if you were wondering about it, no. This was not the lineup in Golden State when Irving lived up to the title. Tristan's ability to vacuum up offensive boards added versatility to the group and made up for his lack of creation or space, as he was top 8 all 3 years in this category. Weak side help opened up corner threes, and any switch gave Kyrie a runway to cook. They steamrolled regular seasons. For 2016 and 17, it was their most used lineup, and the title crew outscored opponents by 13. Their regular seasons were mostly easy sailing. For 2016 and 17, it was their most used lineup, and the Cavs ranked 3rd in offensive rating all 3 years. In the playoffs, the template obviously held up through the East, especially in 2017 when they flat out torched the conference. People rarely remember we very nearly had 2 undefeated teams in the finals. Unfortunately, this supercharged unit only really got one genuine shot at things, and in 17, nothing happening outside of San Francisco really mattered that much. To this day, Cleveland's most successful moments still come with James's name attached. Even after last year's historic start, Dallas caught even me off guard for multiple reasons. It isn't the 2011 title group, not one of Luka's overperforming units. We're going all the way back to Avery Johnson's era 5, who people probably aren't even familiar with anymore. Before Dirk brought gold to this franchise for the first time, he was squeezing the most out of a young Devin Harris, Jason Terry, who'd essentially been Steve Nash's replacement, Josh Howard's single all-star appearance, and big man Eric Dampier. No, not Sagana Diop, who Mark Cuban once mentioned in the same sentence as Shaq. Of course, this was the mid-2000s, and a lot of anything was going for teams who weren't dynasties around the time. They killed in the regular season as well. Harris was ultimately average, yet extremely fast. Terry was mostly the other reliable creator, and Josh showed real potential as a true two-way wing nobody remembers. Dirk simply was the key, as there truly hadn't ever been a big with so many skills matched with his brand of shooting. While his counterpart Dampier provided no reliable creation, he set bruising screens and was supposed to keep Dirk from dabbling in a center's responsibility. It'd only been a few years since management left him out to dry at the position, which created their defense. Over roughly 1,400 possessions, this unit piled up nearly 240 net points with a double-digit net rating. One of the greatest regular season hammers of the decade. Regular season. At the next level, Dirk, Pick and Pop, and late clock Jason Terry provided its ceiling against better units. Wade, Shaq, and a deep retirement home supporting cast shut their 2006 finals run down, mostly as there just weren't many defensive options after Josh Howard for the perimeter. While they did recoup to the tune of 67 wins in 2007 with Dirk winning his only MVP, Don Nelson knew exactly how to make Dirk uncomfortable, and also exploited the double big lineup with small ball for one of history's greatest upsets. Almost nobody believed this method could work at the time, especially Charles Barkley. Dallas wouldn't unlock an actual championship winning version until Tyson Chandler and more wing options tagged along years later. But even then, their most embarrassing year still stands as part of their best lineup by net points. Wait, was that their most embarrassing year? Anyway, Orlando has had next to zero magic since this group, so it's expected that one of Dwight's units makes the cut here. However, not the 09 finals group with Hidu. but the very next iteration that were honestly trying to rush things a bit. Once again, in the early 2010s, we get another shooting blueprint in a time where jump shooting teams could win titles. There was plenty of space in Jameer Nelson, Carter, Barnes, and Rashard Lewis orbiting a defensive juggernaut and the greatest center of his time. Jameer ran tons of high middle PNR with Dwight, and older Vince Carter replaced Turkoglu as the late clock creator. Matt Barnes supplied on-ball defensive edge. Rashard Lewis provided his last good year in the league, hitting 40% from beyond the arc, and Dwight created absolutely everything down low on both sides. It was a genius strategy with the player of his type for the time, as they led the league in threes and went to their second straight conference finals. This five logged a plus 17 net rating over 772 minutes played, absolutely terrorizing the teams at the time who hadn't seen this exact setup too often. Sadly, it showed they maxed out when they went up against the Celtics in the third round. The series pace slowed as Boston switched and flattened the Nelson and Dwight actions. Rashard Lewis fell to 17% from 3 on 23 attempts, meaning the half-court turned into a grind where Boston's size and discipline could load up on Dwight without paying the full price. He did credit Perkins as his toughest defender of the time, and the Celtics all but proved they'd have taken them quite easily a year earlier if healthy. Falling short was disappointing, but like Miami in a way, they gave a glimpse into concepts of the future where their structure would reign supreme over a core like Boston's. Speaking of Orlando, at this time with the New Orleans Hornets, we travel back to 08 when CP3 turned the keys and made magic. The plan of attack was vicious for its time. CP3 and Chandler with high PNR as the base, David West popping to that elbow money spot, which was a key feature of that era's all-star power forwards. Peja Stojakovic leading the league in threes at 7 attempts on 44%, and Morris Peterson as the low-maintenance 3-and-D guard who kept the help honest. We just described spacing, a vertical rim threat, and what we now know was a top point guard of all time. That year, they won 56 games, which qualified for second seed in the West, and to this day, it's argued Paul was robbed of an MVP. Unfortunately, this conference almost always weeds out rosters until it gets to the very best, and they failed to even reach the conference finals after San Antonio figured them out in round 2. The Spurs refused to make mistakes as usual and forced New Orleans to live on tough mid-range and contested catch and shoots when the first action stalled. It turned out to be the trade-off with this 5. When Paul didn't create an advantage early in the clock, there wasn't a second downhill star to bail out the offense. They still managed to push it to 7, and his future leading the unit looked bright, as it often did for young stars who went on to experience cruel subplots. Fun fact: this, by far, remains New Orleans' most successful season to this day, as they haven't even gone on to crack 50 wins since. It would be another decade before Paul himself even got another star guard to run with, when it should have only been a few years, but different story. The Minnesota Timberwolves obviously feature not who you think. Yeah, zero shot you buy this one. I once nearly made a video about the early 2010s Timberwolves who had a glimmer of hope before Ricky Rubio tore his ACL in the lockout season. A couple years later, they returned to produce one of only 2 40-win seasons in the 2010s, and their best record since 2005, which still obviously did not qualify for the postseason, even though it would have slotted them into the East's 8th seed by a couple of games. But yes, no KG Dream Run group here. Third-year Ricky Rubio nearly averaged a double-double, leading Kevin Martin and Corey Brewer on his wings. Kevin Love in possibly the strongest year of his career, with an absolute brute in Nikola Pekovic. Together, they clocked in at plus 271 net points with a plus 12 net rating over a little more than 1,000 minutes. Brewer leaking out for those famous love outlet lasers, Pekovic bruising the paint and freeing Martin with those crazy screens. 3/5 of this core actually made up that promising 2012 squad. But here, an ankle injury to Nikola limited him to just 54 games, begging the question of if his presence could have helped them to the 50-win threshold for a rare postseason appearance. In the regular season, they looked like a playoff team. But on top of the injuries, close game offense shrank when defenses pressured Rubio to produce, who was mostly a passer. And they also switched a lot of Love's actions. End of clock creation relied too heavily on Martin, who was just about at the end of his best days. They also never consistently strung together crunch time stops on the perimeter, resulting in a team that outscored opponents overall, yet kept dropping coin flip finishes, relegating them to an obscure place in history. The fact they appear above Garnett's squad here is a small peek into where some of Love's cores could have gone if they were literally ever healthy. Philly didn't have too much competition. The 2019 crew probably had a shot at the title, but it was actually a year earlier when Ben and Embiid had the best spacing they were ever going to see, with JJ Redick, Robert Covington, and Dario Saric shooting 42, 39, and 37% respectively on good volume. It really didn't matter yet how Joel and Simmons' spacing duties on the court were basically flipped relative to their positions. This five, in just Simmons' rookie year, piled up plus 274 net points with a plus 19 net rating. This truly was the vision of the process, and if you recall the hype, it wasn't a far-fetched idea that they could flirt with the finals in an injured and weakened conference. Simmons drove transition and was already forming into one of the league's great defenders, while handoffs and pin downs supplied plenty of daylight for the shooters. It hasn't been long since I saw a reminiscing Redick Sixers pin down tape on my Twitter timeline. For a stretch, it felt brand new. The 52 games they won treated Philly to its most successful season since they'd made the finals with Allen Iverson. You might remember they also closed the regular season on a 16-game win streak, also the most the franchise had seen in decades. Defensively, Covington's hands, Embiid's rim protection, and Simmons' size gave them switchability that overwhelmed most regular season looks. Then, as it often would for the process-era Sixers, playoff basketball arrived and the lessons were brutal. Boston just dared Simmons, as a guard with zero range, to be effective under postseason schemes. Loaded bodies at Embiid on the catch, and chased Redick off his routes. With no other guard available to reliably create their own offense, all their best perimeter shooters falling to sub 35% averages was a nail in the coffin. They were gentlemen swept by a Boston team missing both its veteran leaders, as Tatum and Brown gave a small glimpse of what was to come. A year later, management went all in, swapping out unreliable postseason shooting for score-first guys, which again probably could have gone all the way, but yeah. At plus 222 net points over around 3,600 possessions, well, the Grizzlies lineup is actually the one landing right before we officially dubbed them Grit and Grind. And for good reason. The usual three dirty work guys you remember, only with actual scoring on the wing provided by OJ Mayo and Rudy Gay. Shedding that young athletic portion eventually led to the "we're gonna wrestle you in the mud for 48 minutes" group. Funny enough, the results pretty perfectly display the differences between the two. In 2011, when Rudy Gay missed the postseason due to injury, they upset the 61-win Spurs as the 8th seed. Albeit San Antonio had run into injury troubles of their own, there wasn't a soul who seriously called Memphis in 6. Then when they made the conference finals in 2013, Rudy Gay had been shipped to Toronto midway through the year. Conclusion? They had real regular season juice as scoring often gives you, but playoff basketball with a slower pace favored something different. Though, for the group in question, Conley and Gasol high PNR was the table setter. Zebo's block bully ball is amongst one of the more underrated forward games ever, and its lack of presence in 2013 versus the Spurs was a huge difference from a couple years earlier. Rudy was wildly athletic with a mid-range and ISO game you'd assume any team like this would need to go all the way, and Mayo spacing as a spot-up guard who could run a side action when needed really topped it off. Only, he played just 4 years there before ending up in trade rumors and had much more potential as a player than he ever reached. If he had, well, his 19 points a game, which had him in Rookie of the Year talks, could have sprouted to something like 22 plus and maybe taken them over the top. Oh, but that imposing frontcourt with Gasol and Zach was crushing to opponents, flat out turning games into half-court brawls. They could wear almost anyone down, including the Baby Warriors in 2015 who very nearly fell victim. It was actually Rudy Gay's shoulder injury in 2011 which forced Tony Allen's defense into the starting group, helping lead to the Spurs' upset. But that also tells you why this five was mostly limited to potential. Finishing the job with Tony Allen was a no-go. However, even when Rudy was healthy and Mayo was starting, the spacing was still kinda cramped, meaning tougher possessions turned into contested twos, and elite playoff defenses could load up on Zebo and Gasol since no perimeter guy shot above average from 3, especially at any kind of volume. Nonetheless, it didn't stop Rudy from just recently taking to podcast to tell us, had he been there, they would have defeated the 2013 Heat in the finals. Yeah, no. But there's no doubt this team, and what came directly after it, were a special part of the 2010s West. After all, they quite literally only lost to OKC, Lob City, San Antonio, and Golden State, as was the story for almost any non-true contender back then. For as much as Sacramento has contributed almost absolutely nothing to the league over 25 years, nobody ever seems to forget their early 2000s run. Would you believe it if I said this does not include Chris Webber though? Their best five of the century actually popped when Chris Webber was out and Brad Miller slid into the void. Miller's a very unknown big to later generations, but he actually made one of two All-Star appearances in 2004 when he started 53 games for the Kings. He and Divock made up two passing bigs at the elbows who made defenses read every single play, which is an obvious formula for a regular season success. You'd get handoffs, backdoor splits, and the ball movement you've no doubt seen clips of through the years. Maybe at this time was serving as one of the best guards who hadn't made an All-Star team. Christie took the nastiest defensive assignment while cutting and keeping the chain moving, next to Peja, who was even better here than he was for New Orleans, averaging 24 a night on 43% from three here 4 years earlier. The offense never stuck, which is only so much of an advantage without a true superstar when it comes to postseason play. They finished 55-27, but when they had to take on MVP Kevin Garnett with a slower, returning Chris Webber, they were unable to get it done in 7. The unit was missing that second star to bully mismatches, and the two-center look from this lineup was liable to be punished by athleticism. Not to mention Webber's late return reshuffled roles, so it was just a difficult break before even accounting for the fact they would have had to see the Lakers again in the next round. The early 2000s Kings still capture the hearts of many fans, and especially the ones in Sacramento who haven't had much to cheer for since. Jazz music stops. When Utah added Bojan Bogdanovic to the mix in 2020, Utah earned their spot in dark horse conversations. Very, very dark. He became a primary option next to the regulars of that core and helped them cook up a plus 296. But this was in 22 when they were only a plus 6 by net rating. This same lineup posted higher averages in both the seasons before. The recipe was simple and effective for the regular season. Spread PNR with Mitchell or Conley pulling to the ball, Gobert rolling, and a 3-man perimeter spacing and cutting. Even without Bojan in the 2020 bubble, this still provided for some of the best basketball ever played in the Denver series. Only, even there, the rinse and repeat style eventually fell short, especially as defenses realized they could frequently disregard Gobert. In 2021, they finished with the league's best record and bombed more threes than anyone while still ranking among the top defenses because Gobert erased mistakes at the rim, and O'Neal took the first tough wing assignment. This also became an issue in spring when it was revealed he really was the only super effective perimeter defender, and I may be using super effective liberally there. The Clippers downsized and went to 5-out spacing, pulling Rudy into space and neutralizing his most effective defensive feature. This, again, was part of teams figuring out they could get by most Jazz defenders and put him in a bad position. By 22, it was even more embarrassing when these same cracks were revealed to a Dallas team who played half the series without Luka. I actually documented my disappointment with the repetitive failures, and it spelled a very clear end for the Gobert-Mitchell build. Overall, it was a great regular season unit and strategy that stood no chance against a good coach with the right talent. To this day, teams relying on Gobert's generational defensive numbers as a major part of their success still fall to the same pits. This one is gonna hurt Rockets fans, as if they haven't experienced enough over a decade. In 220 games played, Houston won 66% of games McGrady and Yao played together. When flanked by Rafer Alston, Battier, and Chuck Hayes, they boasted a plus 18 net rating at 304 net points. Rick Adelman's brand of slow, physical basketball was giving teams hell no one even remembers. Because everyone was busy fawning over Boston's new Big Three and the Fleece sending Gasol to LA, it was hard to lock in the Houston's 22-game winning streak, still standing as the 4th longest in history. Well, it's also because that streak ended at the hands of Boston a couple of weeks after Yao sustained a stress fracture in his foot. When he was present, he was the hub. Touches on either block, elbow handoffs that bent the floor, while Battier parked as the low-maintenance spacer and elite wing stopper. McGrady still had all the skills, including mid-post creation, and remained one of the best ISO players of his generation. He was also at the end of his stardom. Alston pushed pace in spurts and hit just enough threes to be dangerous next to T-Mac. While you probably only know Hayes for that insane free throw in Denver, he was the glue as an undersized 4, doing all the dirty work and letting Yao stay home at the rim. There weren't many units who could go toe-to-toe with them when healthy, which was precisely the problem. Though they did get to run this lineup in 07 as well when they were a plus 27 over 525 minutes played, falling short against the Utah Jazz in 7, which denied us a chance to see them square off with the small ball Warriors. They couldn't beat Utah with Yao, and fell even easier without him the next year. Still, with a little more time and health, they remain one of the biggest what-ifs in history, as they clearly had something there. Washington had a couple realistic options, but in the end, it came down to the Death Row DC season where there were whispers of legitimately challenging Cleveland. With that era's backcourt, who never truly hit their full potential together, Otto Porter Jr. and Markieff Morris spread the floor, while Marcin Gortat followed up as yet another forgotten screener hits the list. On the board, they show plus 332 net points across a huge 4,100 possessions, which tracks because this was one of the most used and most cohesive starting units of the mid-2010s. Wall knifed in the middle, and if help came, it was kickouts to Beal or Porter, two elite spot-up shooters at the time. Not to mention Beal was also an elite creator, but Porter was having possibly his best season in the league in 2017, shooting 43% from 3. Combine it with Morris giving them just enough space at the 4, and Washington as a whole was one of the top offenses in the league, propelling them to 49 wins, which remains their highest win total since 1979 when they last made the finals. The idea was Cleveland would struggle to guard both Wall and Beal, as it's been so long since Beal was super effective, you may have forgotten how fast he was on both ends. Their classic in DC closer to the end of the season sparked excitement, but as usual, we wouldn't get the postseason we wanted. In round 2 against Boston, their lack of depth and defense became apparent. Then the Celtics funneled Wall into crowds, as happens to any modern guard without a fully established jumper. They were also able to lean into their own role guys to swing games. Speaking of which, yeah, Washington was a Kelly Olynyk legacy game away from getting to play Cleveland, which would have been a much more interesting series. If anything, Death Row DC showed what could have been possible with the Wall and Beal core given more consistent health, management, and everything really. This one makes me quite sad for Lillard. I'll never forget his first game against LA and immediately becoming a fan. He did so alongside Wesley Matthews, Batum, and LaMarcus Aldridge, who would join him next season with Robin Lopez to form an extremely underrated and forgotten core. Instantly, Dame displayed extremely deep pull-up gravity as he broke Steph's recently set rookie record for three-pointers made. Matthews ran off of Rip Hamilton-style pin downs. Batum served as the connective passer who kept the ball hopping and could also shoot, while Aldridge was one of the highest skilled bigs of his time with a deep mid-range bag. Lopez topped it off with the generic big duties as a lot of them have on this list. Terry Stott's offense let them shift between motion and a guaranteed bucket whenever the possession stalled, as they were now working with two All-NBA talents. That's exactly what made me so sad for Dame. In 2014, they jumped from 33 to 54 wins, which remains their highest win total since 2000, so their presence makes total sense on the list. Unfortunately, after Lillard officially announced himself with the first-round series dagger against Houston, San Antonio arrived and reminded everyone what a fully kitted contender really looks like. Aldridge's catches got tougher against size, while they also took away Dame's easy 2 to the ball reads and forced Portland into tougher mid-range diets. They were never beating the 2014 Spurs. A year later, the group ceiling took a gut punch when Wesley Matthews tore his Achilles in March before it was popular, and nothing ever quite recovered. Practically the entire core left Dame out to dry over summer, and they began rebuilding with something that looked a little more like a team he would have been drafted to. Damn shame. They probably weren't ever going to scale the West, but shuffling around this Lillard and Aldridge core that went plus 345 over 3,900 possessions with the other three, the potential was clearly there. Despite it being the Lakers, this is honestly one of my favorite teams ever. As we begin rounding out the top 10, LA won the 09 title and proceeded to replace Trevor Ariza with Ron Artest, who they just nearly lost to in round 1. With that, the better question for this unit would be what Kobe didn't do. Operating from the elbow and mid-post while just being a totally impossible cover, Ron providing enough space for the unit to make full use of his bullying on the defensive side. I shouldn't have to explain Fisher's importance, and the Twin Towers might have been the last truly great big duo before the league trended smaller. Gasol's high-low reads and short roll touch fed Bynum's skill set perfectly. If you didn't send help, it was a layup or a whistle, and if you did, Kobe went single coverage and had his way with just about any defender. The overwhelming size of this unit and Phil's triangle structure meshed beautifully. They ranked 3rd in offensive rebounds and 1st amongst playoff teams in that category. Practically no team of that era could match Bynum and Gasol's length for 7 games, which was a huge advantage over Boston in the finals once they lost Kendrick Perkins. Come to think of it, this was one of the last times in the last 15 years an NBA Finals featured 2 teams running traditional double bigs. Like actual double bigs, not a small forward prototype playing power forward or a stretch power forward playing center. Check for yourself, it's been very rare since. By the time this unit flamed out, they'd been trying to make their 3rd straight finals and 4th overall since Bynum didn't play in 08. Dallas defeated the triangle actions with switching and 5-out counters, surprise surprise. Then OKC was just playing at a much higher pace with elite downhill pressure in 2012. At plus 376 net points, this iconic late 2010s lineup stands tall above every other lineup they've had since. And unlike a lot of franchises here, there were plenty to compete with. Along those lines, I'm gonna assume OKC's is getting replaced sooner or later. if you were building a lab version of mid-2010s Thunder basketball, this is it. The second most famous 3-1 victims of all time looked like an absolute wrecking ball in real time, posting plus 403 net points. Though years later, you kinda look back and ask, how? Kendrick Perkins had been phased out for a younger Steven Adams, while Andre Roberson slotted in at the 2 for a nasty defensive guard tandem with Westbrook. Iguodala called them the best team of the 2016 playoff bracket. Athletic, imposing size, star power, and enough shooting to make it all work. For a while. Though Westbrook could handle it, Roberson took the toughest guard or wing matchup given his size, allowing Russ to rack up steals off ball to the tune of ranking 5th in the league. Ibaka rotated between weak side eraser and pick and pop spacer, while the tales of a prime Steven Adams screen still ring throughout the league to this day. They were a regular season sledgehammer, as you simply couldn't convince anyone Russ and KD weren't destined to finish the job at some point and be cemented as an all-time duo. Though in the end, they really needed an answer to that 2 position they never quite found post-Harden. Roberson's lack of spacing didn't completely kill him because he screened, cut, and still was willing to shoot the ball enough to make his defensive benefits feasible to use. You can clearly see the high points looking at the conference finals, where he shot 7 of 14 from 3 up until Game 5 while OKC had a chance to make history. He finished the series 2 of 7, not even shooting in Game 6, as they lost their edge and let an error slip through the cracks. Ibaka had evolved as well. In his first 6 years, he took under 1 3 a game. Here, while contributing to their most dominant lineup of the century by the numbers, he was taking over 2 a game, shooting 32% here and 38% on 3 attempts the year before. He was more reliably popping to 18 to 24 feet, which opened slips for Adams and cleaner lanes for Russ. Though between him and Roberson desperately trying to be useful further from the basket, it paints a clear story of the struggles this franchise was facing that the records might have masked. We'll always be left to wonder what could have been after they reverse swept a 67-win Spurs team who'd added LaMarcus Aldridge to a championship-winning core. Ironically, Golden State downsizing and taking advantage of the fake spacing sent a clear message to KD it was never gonna happen there. Recall the convo we just had. The last champion at this point who were more known for traditional bigs as opposed to small ball was the Lakers or Dallas. Even the 14 Spurs inserted Diaw into the starting lineup to blow the lid off the series in Miami. Durant saw the value in an abundance of shooting and went straight to the source. But he left behind the 9th ranked team on this list, just one of a couple of reasons he received the flack he did. You could have closed your eyes and randomly picked a great Spurs lineup in the last 25, though you probably wouldn't have grabbed their plus 407 lineup with Rasho Nesterovic. There's a name you never ever see mentioned. Yeah, they were just as great as any of the big 3 cores who were truly contending or won it all. This was when Tony Parker was lightning fast, touching the paint at will without a deadly 3-point game to make it happen. Manu had sacrificed so much of himself for the organization, but made 1 of 2 career All-Star appearances with this lineup. An aging Bruce Bowen was as effective as 3-and-D gets, slotting perfectly for an organization who demanded dirty work from everyone, but especially role players. Peak Tim Duncan, that's all. Nesterovic, though. He gave Timmy probably the last reliable center of his prime. Their lack of adequately replacing talent at this position was one of the reasons it took them so many tries to get back to the finals shortly after he was gone. Another big properly setting screens, contesting, boxing out next to Timmy while letting him play center field was a lot to deal with in the 2000s. In 04, they were a Derek Fisher miracle away from beating the Lakers. The next season, they dethroned the champs they would have played, and any watchers of this channel are now well familiar with the Ginobili blunder, which likely kept them out of a second straight finals. Anytime you study Spurs history and wonder why there was such a large gap from 07 to 13, hardly consider the bigs who played with Duncan each year. Well, recently, it would seem 3 Clippers legends here appear to believe their former franchise is a joke, so hilarious timing. But yes, once upon a time, the Lob City Core 3 surrounded by JJ Redick and Matt Barnes were not only the ultimate highlight machine, it really felt they'd finish the job at some point. Over roughly 2,600 possessions, they racked up 469 net points with a plus 18 net rating, all in the process of humiliating multiple mid-2010s players. When they weren't sprinting full speed into a highlight, Redick flew off Iverson cuts and DHOs into quick pull-ups, with Barnes as the low-maintenance glue wing who spaced a corner and took the nastiest perimeter assignment. This was particularly helpful with Paul and Redick being a tiny backcourt. Griffin had a little 15-footer that isn't often remembered and whipped skip passes, while also just sometimes deciding to go above the opponent with his partner in crime down low. If you weren't there, you'll never know how much of a consolation prize it was for fans to hear he was playing with Blake Griffin instead of Kobe. Before a single lob had ever been tossed, it was like the highlights existed in our minds already. As you'll remember from earlier, Paul with West and Chandler was nearly conference finals worthy. 2 vertical bigs was a dream. Hopefully it isn't forgotten how they were one of the league's cleanest offensive machines and, like many West teams, only fell short to the toughest opponents and circumstances. Before the obvious misfortunes though, if Redick's movement shooting was chased off his routes as teams would often game plan for in the postseason, the creation past Paul and Griffin in this lineup thinned out. While Jordan became a defensive juggernaut and part of the highlight machine, Haka DJ was absolutely a thing which broke rhythm, and a great defensive team could load bodies at Griffin's roles. In 2014, they flat out lost a tight series to Oklahoma, and they just looked a little deflated after a questionable ending to Game 5. It was one of those miracle territory games. Then, in the process of dethroning San Antonio of all teams, Paul's hamstring curse began, holding him out of 2 Houston series games shortly before they blew a 3-1 lead in the most Clippers way possible. Yeah, they only specifically had this lineup for 2 of the 6 Lob City years, and served as the absolute closest they ever came to glory. Sadly, as we now know, things never really got much better afterwards. I looked at this and thought to myself, Jason Richardson played with Joe Johnson in Phoenix? In reality, it was actually Q Rich, who in his lone season with the Suns during 2005 shot a league-leading 8 3-pointers a game, while making roughly 3. It's really no wonder the famous 7 seconds or less lineup trailblazed on offense, as he spaced for the ultimate new age point guard in Steve Nash, an upcoming creator in Joe Johnson, futuristic Swiss Army knife Sean Marion, and as Carmelo describes it, the man-child Amari Stoudemire. They rang up plus 471 as a nightly highlight reel with the math behind it. The Nash and Stoudemire pick and roll was a nightmare, but as destructively athletic as Amari was, he had so many skills to go with it that just made him a punishing cover. Unlike a team we just covered who could struggle to create out of a guard-big duo, Joe Johnson provided secondary creation, showing the potential which eventually led him to 7 All-Star appearances. This lineup having one big, a point guard who could score as well as he could pass, a versatile small forward playing the 4, and multiple shooters was pretty ahead of its time, falling short for the obvious reasons you might think in this era. Despite winning 62 games in 05, they were in the bottom half of the league defensively due to the trade-offs. When the pace slowed against the Spurs in the West Finals, San Antonio crowded Nash's lanes and punished the glass, forcing Phoenix to win the half-court stops and post defense, which was a tall task with or without Joe Johnson. You may recall from the Spurs video years ago, his facial fracture cost him 2 games, which obviously dwindled Phoenix's options against Elite D. Still, they also would have had to rack up enough stops. He then moved on to spread his wings with the Hawks. So this specific iteration of D'Antoni's innovative style only got one crack at it, and it remained tied with their highest franchise win total up until 2022 when it was outdone by their finals group. For all you've ever heard about the run and gun Suns, their appearance falling right outside the top 5 of lineups this century feels right. A pretty static feature of the 2020s so far is how if Jokic has good teammates, the Nuggets are almost automatically contending. In 2023, he had more than that after Jamal Murray finally returned from ACL surgery, and they acquired the perfect 2 in Caldwell Pope, having already acquired a perfect cutting partner in Aaron Gordon years ago when they easily could have been contending as well. This 5 posted plus 483 net points, and of course went on to immediately win the title. With Jokic running the show, Murray returned as the secondary creator they sorely missed. KCP really didn't need the ball unless he was ready to shoot, which he did to the tune of 42% from the arc, landing him just outside the top 10 by a hair. This made it possible to get full use of his defensive abilities, making him the exact kind of 2 OKC truly needed earlier in this list. Regardless of the jokes that have flown through the years, Porter Jr. was especially efficient in the title year, as another spacer who allowed Aaron Gordon to be at his best. Yeah, AG, another defender on the wing by the way. You really could see it coming from a mile away. Which is why it was so funny they were a little discredited in real time for the teams they played. Jokic's vision with spacers, cutters, and defenders to help keep him out of regular actions was an obvious formula for success. And it was a big reason we were scratching our heads about the roster decisions for the next couple of years. Every possession produced an advantage, which did enough to make the 2023 champs a top 5 lineup of this century. In spring of 2016, when I first caught wind the Warriors may be interested in making space for Durant, this group had been dominant enough that I questioned why they'd go through the trouble. So despite the near decade of blazing hot offense with different lineups, the 73-9 Warriors stand alone 10 years later as their best lineup by net points. I specify this for them because their smaller lineups played an even heavier role in their success. This is the pre-death lineup, before Bogut and Barnes were tossed overboard for perfection. Still, if you were around, you remember these games being over by halftime, and for good reason. Even before that, in 2015, this had been the vision Kerr brought to Golden State. He imagined 2 bigs moving and screening for what Mark Jackson had just previously called the greatest backcourt of all time. Only it's rarely remembered how David Lee's injury moved Draymond to the starting lineup, while Kerr envisioned a Ginobili-like role for Iggy. The rest was history. 2015 Curry was one thing, being as dangerous on ball as he was off it. It was something entirely different when he came into 2016 looking for blood right away, confidently pulling up from distances normally reserved for late clock looks. Thompson not only lived beside him as possibly the second greatest shooter ever, but he also took the toughest matchup, allowing Steph to play lanes and lead the league in steals during his second MVP campaign. Barnes was the quiet fit, strong enough to guard up, allegedly spaced the corner, and ran the lane for those push-ahead Steph passes that felt like layup lines. Only his absolute disappearance in the franchise's most important moment made him an easy cut over summer. Draymond Green became the league's most dangerous short-roll playmaker, flipping a basic trap on Curry into 4-on-3 layups and corner threes, while quarterbacking the defense, which he does to this day in his mid-30s. Bogut is the forgotten piece, setting those concrete screens Kerr imagined while protecting the rim if the defense ever did break down. A hilarious note when you remember people have regularly tried to dismiss his injury in 2016. This five set the nightly tone, taking the league by storm in early 2014 when they'd originally been projected as an average Western team. Though not only did they not win the title convincingly, as mentioned way earlier in this list, it was Kerr's deference to small ball that really wrapped things up. Part of the reason it felt like a season-long event when they were headed to break Chicago's record, as opposed to today where you hear little about OKC getting ready to do it, was how much vengeance they entered the repeat year with. They wanted the disrespect to stop, and were well on their way to doing it until the luck factor just fell apart in the playoffs. Curry's burst was inconsistent during the run after the injury. Then they were tasked with finishing 2016 Braun without a true backline. Regardless, everything in life is optics. And Curry declaring he was back in Portland, their triumph over OKC, then holding a 3-1 in the finals which had never been dropped, will forever be seared into the minds of NBA fans. Then their hyper team which followed after does the rest. But it doesn't change how the winningest team in history, for now, lands here at number 4 with nearly plus 500 net points. Fun fact. Indiana's appearance in the top 5 makes them the only lineup there to not have at least gone to the NBA Finals. There were a few extenuating circumstances. But yes, the lineup who once upon a time posted like a 90s rap group also racked up 5,000 plus possessions together, which is a good bit more than anybody else here, and the third highest on this list. They were good. They obviously weren't too much better than a lot of the teams here, if at all. When the East needed a hero, Paul George replaced Danny Granger as the face of the franchise, adding stardom and size to a roster with an already imposing front line. Oh look, David West here again. Do your homework, kids. For 2 straight seasons, they dished out bruising defense and enough shot making to make Miami sweat. This was the part which caught nearly everyone by surprise in the conference finals. George Hill had been acquired in the deal sending Kawhi out of town before he put a jersey on, though he filled what they needed at the time. He steadied the steering wheel, but most importantly allowed Paul George to grow into a top-shelf wing as quickly as they needed. Lance became the chaos valve, shining as a secondary handler next to PG, which silently spoke to how good they could have been if Granger continued that role instead. The size of Hibbert and West directly challenged what we talked about with Miami earlier, Roy looking like the next great big off the strength of those games. In 2013, they finished number 1 in defensive efficiency, falling short of the finals by a single game. Unfortunately, it only got worse the next year when, despite finishing first seed, they again fell short to Miami's small ball stretches. If you'll recall the recent 2015 Hawks video, ATL had already set the tone showing how to neutralize their size with shooting and pace. Bosh at the 5 pulled Hibbert out of his comfort zone and muted the rim advantage that may have gotten the job done just a couple of years earlier. It didn't help how Indy's half-court diet could get predictable, and on that front, the talent just wasn't really there to go toe-to-toe with a big 3. These 5 made up one of the more iconic units of the 2010s, and only got 2 shots at it before injury dismantled the PG era. They were likely just a better point guard away from truly belonging with the teams this high up. But as you might also recall, this time from the Pacers video, they were far too cursed to have many franchise lineups compete here. As we begin to round this out, we take another huge possession leap as the Pistons' last title team seemingly stayed put forever, with 6,000 possessions. The unit still responsible for the biggest upset in finals history posted plus 812. Sustaining excellence for 3 straight seasons. They also remained the last team to win a title without an MVP or former MVP on the roster. They were relentless from night to night at the principles they were great at. Billups organized and punished every mistake, also marking as one of the best 3-point shooting guards of the era. Rip simply never stopped running, making floppy action and pin downs a huge drain on defenders. After watching the 04 finals, it felt like one of the bigger reasons Kobe became ineffective. Tayshaun was a lanky defender who could also score if needed, but he was mostly intimidating as the first line of defense before things got really ugly down low. While Ben Wallace couldn't shoot, he still attempted the mid-range, and Sheets pick and pop with his general spacing offset Ben enough to let them get the most out of his rim protection and rebounding. This unit deserves the respect their second spot on this list provides. Not only did they smother LA, but were mere possessions away from taking out San Antonio the very next year, which would have been a badge like no other. By 06, they were still churning out 64 wins behind the same template, but Wade and Shaq broke through as it always only felt like a matter of time. Not to mention the support behind this Detroit lineup just wasn't as good by then. It was their last chance at glory before Big Ben moved on, really ending Detroit's notable success up until around just now. Ben's role in setting the culture on the backline could not have been clearer than when they were missing it in 07 against a young LeBron. Crazy how history works, because a different decision on draft night 03 and this specific lineup never exists. Regardless, they were dominant. The variations of this team were good enough that they went on to a now forgotten 6 straight Eastern Conference Finals. And last but certainly not least, the lineup responsible for initially inspiring the super team era. The greatest net points hammer on the entire board came from a team many knew had won the title the minute they joined together. Over the course of 6,641 possessions, this five racked up 1,003 net points. From opening night 07, it looked like an NBA team had been assembled in a lab. Rondo was a blur in transition and did these probe dribbles to kick out to his shooters, which kinda neutralized the fact he didn't have a shot his own. The best shooter in history at the time was sprinting through screens, while defenses still had to account for both Pierce and KG. Then, the stalwart next to Garnett might never get proper credit given his post-career persona, but Perk being potent enough on defense to make Dwight Howard work was legendary next to the Defensive Player of the Year in 08. It was that side of the ball that made it acceptable to have both a point guard and center who weren't too respected offensively. It was a defense manned by Tom Thibodeau, by the way, and KG's backline communication erased mistakes before they ever happened. They were the #1 defense in 08 by a mile, moving through a 66-win stroll, which improved on their 07 record better than anyone had in history. A couple of series to start were way closer than they should have been, but they ultimately survived to fulfill preseason predictions. They didn't let up in 09 either, when they were 27-2 headed into Christmas Day, only to be derailed months later by an injury zapping KG's prime movement. Even then, they recovered to run through the East in 2010 with a slower, nastier version of the same identity, falling to the Lakers' best lineup of the century, which was already a tall task even when Perkins was playing. It was a bar fight that just slightly went the other way in 7. Over 25 seasons of lineups on this list, nobody stacked more cumulative scoreboard damage than the team who showed LeBron he was gonna have to force the issue if he wanted to see another finals. From there, a domino effect launched, causing team after team to try to use the same formula, spawning multiple modern basketball principles in the process.